So let us continue with the organs associated with the lymphatic system. So the first one we're going to look at today is the spleen. So if you take a look at the spleen as far as the location of the organ, it would be located on the left side of the abdominal cavity, right by the side of the stomach. If you look at it in a sense of histology, what you will observe is two separate structures within your spleen. You have these areas that are considered to be the white pulp, and majority of the spleen is considered to be the red pulp, which kind of also gives the color of the spleen as well. So the white pulp is the location where you will have the storage of a significant number of the lymphocytes, where when you compare the red pulp is the location where your red blood cells are taken to be destroyed. And also it is the site when you destroy any type of pathogens that have entered your circulation, your blood circulation, and are considered to be blood-borne pathogens. White pulp, on the other hand, are dealing with the fluid that is coming or is basically a storage of your lymphocytes and are responsible for activating your immune cells to again create an defense or an immune response against the pathogen. The next organ we have, let me talk about the homeostatic imbalances. One thing interesting about the spleen is that if a spleen is removed in children or young adults, a spleen has the ability, I should say, if you leave a piece of a spleen inside and take majority of it out, a spleen can regenerate itself. That being said, if a spleen is damaged or ruptured, it will be removed through a process called a splenectomy, which is basically simply removal of a spleen. People do survive without a spleen, and that's okay. But again, because it's the chance of a spleen repairing itself is pretty high, nowadays they try to prevent this procedure from taking place, and they just do procedures to stop the bleeding rather than complete removal of a spleen. Now we're going to be focusing on a structure referred to as mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or simply MALT. These are basically not complete complex organs, rather than they are typically collections of lymphatic cells that are placed in different locations of the body with the goal of identifying any antigens associated with pathogens and activating an immune response. The examples of MALT are tonsils, Peyer's patches, and appendix. If you guys do remember, we mentioned tonsils earlier. It is located around your pharynx or your throat. There are a total of 4 sets. And remember that I mentioned that these structures are not complex, rather than relatively simple. And they are going to be acting as the first barrier for anything that enters through your mouth or through your nasal cavity. So these are, think about them again as the first line of defense. If they do come in contact with anything through your mouth or your anything that is passing through the air, they are the ones that are going to activate your lymphocytes and trigger an immune response. If they are a significant response in the tonsils, then you have basically the swelling of the tonsils that also causes a lot of sore throat in many people. Peyer patches, as I mentioned, these are basically molds that are located on the folds of the small intestine. Their job is to make sure that the bacteria that are part of the intestines are not breaching those walls and cause infection or sepsis within the abdominal cavity. And again, all they are is basically collections of lymphatic cells. Next, you have your appendix, which is located at the beginning of the large intestine. So this part is called the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine you see right here. So appendix is located right there. The function is also similar to what we described for Peyer's patches, where they are basically preventing any bacteria that might breach the intestinal wall to cause infection inside the abdominal cavity. They also play a major role in creating memory. What I mean by memory is this, that a lot of times when you get exposed to a bacteria or virus for the first time, it takes a while for your body to respond to that. However, if you have a second exposure to the same virus or bacteria, your body responds much faster. And the reason for it is because your immune cells now have memory for the original bacteria and virus. So when they encounter that bacteria or virus for the second time, it's much easier for them to recognize it. The process is much more rapid. And appendix is one of the structures that is responsible for creating those memories and basically helping you create an effective immune response against a pathogen that you have already encountered in earlier time. Thymus is technically part of your primary organ system or primary lymphoid organs. It is considered to be a bilobed structure, and you can see it here. You have two separate lobes. It sits on the superior region of the heart. And the interesting fact about the thymus is that as individuals start to age, the activity of the thymus starts to decrease because thymus starts to atrophy. So in young age, thymus is highly active because it's responsible for maturing your T cells and making them immunocompetent, which basically means, again, have the ability to recognize an antigen and trigger and activate and trigger an immune response for them. Note that thymus does not directly interact and cause an immune response because all it does is responsible for maturation of the T cells, but it does not store them. Now, moving on from the organs of the lymphatic system, we're going to be talking about the two main categories of defense or immune responses that are created in your body. The second one that we have listed here, known as adaptive, we already mentioned it briefly. Adaptive is adaptive is also known as a specific defense system. It is a very particular immunity that targets a very specific antigen, and it takes a longer process compared to a more basic version of our defense, which is known as the innate or non-specific defense system. So innate or non-specific defense system is identified as a first line of defense, and it actually works in, or should say, first and second line of defense, as it works in two distinct levels. One is basically providing external protection that prevents the bacteria from getting into your system in the first place. And the second line of defense is when that bacteria actually, or that pathogen, I should say, general term, if pathogens has been able to gain access to your body by passing the first line of defense, then second line of defense comes into act, where you have phagocytosis and other mechanisms such as inflammation and fever to prevent the spread of the infection. Now, while the innate immunity is at work, you're slowly activating your adaptive or specific defense system for the longer run and making sure that the infection is going to be completely removed. Here's just an idea about the breakdown of your immune system. When we think about the innate or non-specific immunity, we have your surface barriers, and if those surface barriers are breached, then you rely on your internal defenses, such as I mentioned, inflammation, phagocytosis, fever, antimicrobial proteins, etc., to defend the body. And while that is happening, in many cases, you also start to activate your adaptive defense, which is made up of your B cells and your T cells. Now, the defense that arises from the B cells are referred to as humoral immunity, and the defense that arises from T cell is referred to as cellular immunity. So the rest of this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the innate defense and not the adaptive. So let's take a look at the innate immunity. As I mentioned, innate is broken down to two main lines of defense. One is surface barriers that prevent any pathogen to get into your system. Now, what are those barriers include? The skin is a main one, and you also have a lot of mucous membrane that lines a lot of your cavities that are open to the outside to prevent those pathogens from basically gaining access to your inner structures. So let's take a look at some of these. First is the acidity of the skin and some of the mucus secretions that your body produces. And that acidic environment is going to prevent many of the pathogen growth. You also release enzymes within your saliva, within your stomach, and your respiratory system that acts as basically sanitizers. It destroys and kills many of the organisms. So you might put something in your mouth that might be dirty and might have pathogens on it, but the enzymes in your saliva and your stomach will destroy quite a few number of those. We have mucin, which is a very thick lining within your digestive and respiratory system that traps many of the microorganisms and basically sends them to be destroyed by phagocytosis. And you also have other chemicals in your sweat that are considered to be toxic to many of the bacteria. Now, when you talk about second line of defense, if the first one is breached and you now have a pathogen inside your body, then you have the second line of defense within your innate immunity activated. That includes phagocytosis, natural killer cells, inflammation, antibacterial proteins or complement proteins, and fever. Now notice that the word innate, when we talk about innate immunity, there is no specific recognition. They have pattern recognitions, but they are very wide, they're very broad, and they're not as specific as what you will see in adaptive immunity, where a very specific antigen is used to identify the pathogen. In this case, what is being recognized is very broad and it's not particular. So let's talk about phagocytosis. You should be very comfortable with these type of cells. They're the ones that eat up the bacteria, and you can see in this picture as represented, you have your bacteria here outside the cell. This is your macrophages. They are trapping the bacteria by bringing these long extensions and bringing in the cell through the process of phagocytosis, which you can see here. After they come in, they are going to be bundled up with the lysosomes. And if you guys remember, lysosomes carry a significant amount of acidic vacuoles that when mixed with your bacteria causes the degradation of the bacteria, and then the whatever is left of the degraded bacteria basically removed through the process of exocytosis. The two main categories are neutrophils and macrophages, and the immature macrophages are considered to be monocytes. Natural killer cells are cells that are promoting a process called apoptosis. This process, or apoptosis, is basically a cell suicide or cell death. So when a cell has been infected or has been damaged in typically a virus or a cancerous cell that is basically not the self cells anymore, natural killer cells are going to be identifying these cells by identifying abnormalities on the antigen. And as a result, it's going to promote that cell to commit suicide. Note that these are part of the innate immunity, which means they will not carry any sort of memory as part of their process. Inflammation is another part of the second line of defense within your innate immunity. There is a lot of benefits coming from inflammation. First of all, through inflammation, you prevent the spread of the damage to the other parts of the body. You remove the cell debris and pathogens. You are triggering a mechanism that activates adaptive immunity and making that ready to fight off infection. And again, it sets up the stage for the repair caused by the damage, either because of the way the pathogen entered or the damages that are caused directly by the pathogen itself. So, four main characteristics of inflammation include redness, heat, swelling, and pain. So how are each of these are created? So as we go through this, let's take a look at the stages that is responsible for creating an inflammation. So first of all, when there is a damage to your tissue, which basically means your first line of innate immunity is compromised, you have inflammatory chemicals that are being released by the damaged tissue, and that includes histamine, which basically triggers an inflammation. And that causes the blood vessels within that region to basically open up or vasodilate. And that's the really good point about vasodilation is that it allows those blood vessels to be more permeable, which means that the chemicals that are required can be leaked out to basically help with the damaged tissue. So in this case, we're also attracting other type of white blood cells, your categories of leukocytes, and that causes basically an increase in the redness of the tissue because you have more blood flowing to the tissue. You also have the process called hyperimenia, which basically means that is basically means congestion with blood, and these processes, what happens is you have a lot of fluid coming in, a lot of white blood cells coming in, you have an increase in blood supply, which means more heat, and what you do is you actually allow these foreign material, even if they got into, to get into your circulation, which eventually end up in your lymphatic system and lymphatic vessels and in your lymph nodes, and through that your lymph nodes basically going to be filtering any pathogens that were able to gain access to your body. Remember when we talk about leukocytes, the two main categories of your leukocytes were neutrophils and macrophages that are going to be responsible for phagocytosis of any debris or particles that now have gained access into your body. Here is the process that we're describing. Remember that bacteria and the process of phagocytosis takes place. Your blood vessels are dilating, allowing more circulation to the tissue. And the word that you should know already is the diapedesis, which basically means your white blood cells are going to leak out of the capillaries and get into your tissue. Another cool mechanism that your body actually fights off at the second line of defense in the innate immunity is by releasing antimicrobial proteins that help with enhancing your immune response. They also limit the microorganism ability to grow and reproduce. And one of the most important of these antimicrobial protein is called the complement protein, which you see in these orange structures. So green in this picture is your bacteria, and the complement proteins are the orange. So what this complement protein does is actually create these tiny pores throughout the wall of the bacteria, which allows the fluid to basically come into the cell, making the bacteria swell and eventually burst, causing the destruction of the pathogen. One of the symptoms or characteristics of inflammation is fever. So fever is actually a good thing for our body unless it's maintained continuously for a long period of time, which then can cause damage to your proteins. But high temperature has two functions. One is that it limits the growth of the invading microorganism because typically that means their proper and their happy environment and moderate optimal environment has been compromised. The second thing it causes is it allows the liver and spleen to start to intake a higher concentration of iron and zinc, which are the two essential components needed for the bacterial growth, for most of the microorganism growth. And then by increasing the body temperature, you're also increasing your metabolic rate, which means processes such as phagocytosis and repair can take place at a faster pace and helping you recover from the damage caused by your pathogens. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue with adaptive immunity in your next PowerPoint.